Okay, hey everyone, welcome to my Pinniped Demo. Quick disclaimer before I start, this is all open source, has no affiliations with any company. Everything done here can be done by anybody, anywhere, and doesn't use any company specific software or um, accounts or anything like that. So let's get into it. So what is Pinniped? Pinniped is a open source project developed by VMware that provides a unified way to manage authentication for Kubernetes clusters. So what does that mean? Like in a lot of enterprise settings, we have multiple clusters. So Pinniped's goal is to kind of have a unified way to be able to log into the cluster as a user persona or a user who is part of a group, or they do have some sort of support for service accounts. So user is a person and service account would be machine to machine interactions. So non-interactive login pretty much. Um, so my setup here today, I have some clusters, some GKE clusters and some local clusters. So if I say kubectl get, I have an alias for kubectl by the way. Kubectl get, okay, it's config get contexts. So don't worry about Minikube. This is another cluster which I just have locally, but what we want to focus on are these clusters, right? So I have a GKE supervisor cluster, I have a GKE workload cluster, and I also have a kind workload cluster. So my supervisor and two workloads, right? Of different distros. That's also important. Okay, let's go back to the documentation. So Pinniped has two main components, and one is the supervisor. And the supervisor is a component that acts as an OIDC provider, right? So this performs federated authentication from various identity providers like LDAP, Active Directory, or any other OIDC providers. They have a long list which they support. So GitLab, which I'll be using for the purpose of this demo, Dex, Azure, AD, they also support like most of the basic ones. So that's the supervisor, right? So you saw I had a supervisor cluster. The supervisor component will be installed on your supervisor cluster. And then your concierge is the other component, right? So this is the other component which sits on your workload clusters. This is what will talk to your supervisor cluster to get some authentication keys and secrets and the stuff it'll use to connect you to your cluster. That's the concierge, right? So I'll explain more about how it works, but for now, there's two components, the supervisor and the concierge. Okay, so right now I'm on my supervisor cluster. So if I say kget pods, we'll see I have some supervisor pods running. This is required for your supervisor. You're gonna need to have these pods running and to have some custom resources that these pods will operate on. So this is the main architecture diagram of like how Pinniped works. I'll just go through it really quickly, but we'll see it in action. Think about this part right here as the client machine. So when we say kubectl get pods, that's what we're talking about here. This is the supervisor cluster. So this is this cluster I'm on right now to the left. And we have workload clusters, right? So at the start, I showed you I had some clusters. Those other two clusters, those would be my workload clusters. So those would be what will talk to the supervisor cluster. So we're gonna, behind the scenes, I've already done some configuration to have the workload clusters trust the supervisor cluster. So it's just some CRDs you'll install and some custom resources here. Same here, so all can be done without going through and finicking with the Kube API server or anything internal to Kubernetes. It's just custom resources you apply to the cluster, so it could also be managed by GitOps tools as well. So yeah, so just really quickly, someone says kubectl get pods, user persona. It goes through the Pinniped exec plugin. So that's important because this depends on the plugin. So similar to, I would say kube login for Azure, when you want to log into AKS clusters, this is something similar in that sense. So I'll show you more about that in a bit, but it'll go through the Pinniped exec plugin, talk to your supervisor, Your supervisor will go to your external IDP, in this case GitLab, which I have already configured, by the way. So this is not all magic. There's something called OIDC identity provider, which I've configured as GitLab. There's a client ID, client secret, so it knows where to go, it knows what to look for. This configuration has to be done by an admin of the cluster. So a cluster can have two user types. There's admin and then user. So admin is the person that can do almost anything in the cluster. Users are more restricted, pretty much. Okay. All right, so kubectl get pods, it'll go here, go to GitLab, get the identities, and come back with some information that these are just tokens, IDs, secrets that it'll use to identify me as a user. And then those cannot be understood by the host Kubernetes cluster. So when I say host Kubernetes clusters, I mean the workload cluster here. So you get those from your identity provider here. It comes back through here. It's comes here to the Kubernetes API server. There's a Pinniped aggregated API, which is installed by, it's just those custom resources that we have on the concierge. So I will also show that in a sec. Let me actually, okay. I'll show that in a bit. So what happens then is it'll exchange these tokens for Kubernetes API server credentials that the host Kubernetes cluster can understand. So whatever you get back from your identity provider and inherently from your supervisor, this cluster can understand that. So what happens here is this credential exchange request will exchange those requests for the ones that the host cluster can understand. It'll do that, confirm your identity one more time, and then actually come back and make the final request here to get pods. And that includes the authenticated tokens that you could use to like list or do whatever, just actually not list or get pods. So this tokens is just to authenticate to the server. You can't do any get or whatever unless you have RBAC configured for that user. And I will demonstrate that. So enough talk really. Let's go into the demo. All right. So supervisor cluster is all good and fun, but it's not really what we want to use. We want to use the workload cluster. The supervisor cluster is just there to be able to configure your identity provider, but the workload clusters are what's going to talk to the supervisor cluster. So I'm going to switch to my workload cluster 1, and I'm going to try to do a simple get pods, right? But the difference now is I'm going to pass in a kube config from that I've generated with Pinniped. So as an admin, I could generate kube config. So Pinniped get kube config. So what this will do, only as an admin persona can I do this. I could use the Pinniped CLI to get a kube config that is specific to this cluster. So this will just print out to the console right here. So I will just show you some key things to notice. The name of the cluster, so it's specific to this cluster. Don't worry, there's no certificates or anything here. That's the good thing about Pinniped too. So this kube config can be sent to anyone, right? It can be sent to as many developers as you need. So all it does is it'll use the Pinniped exec plugin to talk to the supervisor, which in turn will go to whatever identity provider you've configured and try to retrieve those credentials. So it'll ask you to log in. So for the purpose of this, is going to be GitLab. So I'll log into GitLab, get those tokens, then come back, and then it'll do this credential exchange request that I talked about here. And that's when you can then log into this cluster. So I already have those kube configs set up, by the way. I have it in here for both my clusters. Okay, so what I could do now is k get pods. I'll actually do. Okay, get pods. But what I'm doing here that's different is by default, if I do kubectl get pods without passing in the kube config, it goes to your home directory.cube./config file, which has like admin kube config right there. So that's what I use to set this all up. But as a user persona, you don't have access to that, right? So imagine me somewhere else where I don't have access to that kube config. This is what you would be doing. You would pass in this kube config that I've generated for you. So if I try to get pods, what will happen is it'll prompt me to log into GitLab. So I have created I've created a test user here. The name is Jon Snow, the Rightful King, in honor of Game of Thrones. And the password, I created a dummy password that I'll just put in. All right. So I'll sign in here, and what should happen is I'll get a message saying login succeeded. But you notice that the login did succeed, but pods is forbidding user Jon Snow, Rightful King cannot list resources. That's because Pinniped does authentication, not authorization. So authorization is handled by Kubernetes native RBAC. So what I could do if I want to actually get pods is create a cluster role binding for myself, or Jon Snow in this case. So I just have a handy command here already ready to go. So what I'll do is create that cluster role binding. So if I try again, you'll notice that it's not gonna prompt me again to do another login, right? It's just gonna log in straight ahead, because what Pinniped does on the background is it maintains some session keys. So you don't need to log in every time. It just maintains those for you, so we don't have to keep going back and forth with the browser. Okay, so cool. Now I can get pods because I've added that cluster role binding. So again, Pinniped does authentication, not authorization. Authorization is done by RBAC. So authentication is just, I can access this cluster. What can I do in this cluster? That's RBAC. All right. Okay, so remember I had 2 workload clusters, right? So let me go to my other workload cluster, and we could try to do the same thing there. But remember, this cluster is local, right? So it's a local kind cluster I've created. So it's not GKE, different distro, but I mean, still Kubernetes. Kubernetes is Kubernetes, just different flavor, pretty much. So same exact command, but this time I'm gonna use my kind kube config that I've configured for this cluster. So the beauty about Pinniped is that from cluster to cluster, as long as both clusters are configured to trust the same supervisor, you won't need to log in again. So on a supervisor, you could configure different custom resources called federation domains. So for each federation domain, you could have multiple clusters, in this sense, workload clusters that are configured to trust that federation domain. And then what will happen is once you log into any one of the clusters, you're logged into all that trust that federation domain. So it's kind of like that. There's that little grouping there for you. Okay, so let's try this. And what should happen is I should be able to get pods. Nice. So if we notice I could get pods, and again, this is my local kind cluster, not GKE. I think this kindnet just kind of shows you that, and this is different from what we got up here. This is a GKE cluster. This is a whole different cluster, but I'm using a different kube config which I created for this cluster, and it's not asking me to sign in again because I have signed in once for another cluster that trusts the same federation domain or supervisor in this case. So if I wanted to log in as another user, I would just I'll have to remove this session keys I was talking about. So Pinniped stores these session keys in this home.config Pinniped. So I just need to clear this out. And what I'll be able to do is log in as, say, another user or someone else. So now I've cleared that. If I ran the same exact command again, let me look for it. Okay, so let's try my GKE workload 1 cluster. If I try this, so because I'm already logged in on the browser, it just automatically connects me. What I could do is remove it again, but instead I go to GitLab and I will sign out. All right, so let me remove those session keys again. So if I try to do this again, then it doesn't matter which cluster really, I could do the kind cluster. Let me do that. Okay, so this time I'll log in as myself, just to show you like it works for multiple people. Let's verify that I'm human because I am. All right, so similar issue here. Osinar Guemo cannot list resources pods in this cluster. I just have to create role bindings for myself, and once I do that, I should be able to see. Okay, so I just created that role binding. So now I should be able to do the same exact command and pass in that kube config for my kind cluster. I can get pods again, but this time as myself, so that's the difference. Like before I was Jon Snow, now myself. All I needed to do was just remove those session keys. But Pinniped is heavily like user centric, so that's why I think it has that concept of session keys. But in a environment where you need to log in and many people, like a shared environment pretty much, I think the setup would have to be a little bit different there. Inherently, the documentation doesn't suggest any way to stop producing those session keys, but maybe we could like write a script or something to refresh that on every command or something like that. Something else I wanted to call out was that Pinniped is very user-centric, yes, but it offers a way for you to do like servers-to-servers authentication. I think there's a whole page right here that talks about that. Yeah, so this is very similar to what we've done already, but the difference is it's non-interactive, which means you would just need to set the Pinniped username and Pinniped password for like this kubectl process. So I would just set those environment variables and it will automatically log me in without me having to like do a browser flow or other things. But I'm not gonna show that right now because I haven't yet configured that, but it's a very simple configuration. Like you just need to change this when you're generating the kube config. But yeah, so that's a lot about Pinniped. One more thing I wanted to point out. You may notice that, yes, it keeps those session keys, but is that safe? How long does it keep it for? Currently, it's not configurable. They have it set to 9 hours. So after every 9 hours, a user will have to log in again. The next thing would be, what if, say, it's an enterprise setting and some person is fired from the company and we want this person to be terminated immediately? They do like a check everything every 5 minutes with the identity provider. So Azure Active Directory, for example. So it'll go check, is this person still authorized? If not, then it'll cut that off. So that's at least a bit secure there. A lot more Pinniped has to offer. You could use the concierge with the supervisor, which is what I've shown you. You could use the concierge with webhooks. You could use your supervisor without the concierge. All these are just other like deployment strategies for Pinniped, but for enterprise settings where you have multiple clusters, I think the concierge with the supervisor is what you want to look at. These are more very specific cases which may not really make a lot of sense. But yeah, all right. I will take questions in the comments. Thank you guys.